If you couldn't have guessed, I'm a huge fan of Rich Harris. I genuinely look up to him. He kind of proved to me that a well-dressed, well-spoken JavaScript nerd could make a splash. And I certainly wouldn't have started YouTube if it wasn't for the incredible talks he'd been giving for the 3+ years before. Rethinking Reactivity and Computer Build Me an App are legitimately two of my all-time favorite talks, and I dearly love the impact he has had. And yeah, I owe him massively for my success, which is why as soon as I heard that there was a new talk of his, I couldn't be more excited to watch. And also why when Lee Robb told me I could go react to it, I was, very hyped. So Rich did a new talk all about his spiciest takes about the modern web, and he was actually encouraged by VERCEL to go as spicy as he wanted. And the result is something incredible. And I'm really excited to watch this with y'all right now. So let's go take a look.
Giving a talk tonight called In My Humble Opinion. And it's a collection of loosely connected thoughts about recent trends in front-end development. There's a lot of really interesting and innovative stuff happening in the front-end world at the moment, and this is as good a time as any to take stock of it.
There's some open source package that lets you quickly build a website that is a presentation. I like that he's doing this in JavaScript and not caving and using Keynote or PowerPoint like the rest of us. But yeah.
So I'm going to be sharing some opinions of varying levels of spiciness, and I'm going to talk about how those opinions shape the design of Svelte and SvelteKit. I'm not here to try and convince you of anything. You'll probably find lots to disagree with me about, but hopefully this will give you some insight into how we think about our role as toolmakers. Now, it takes a certain lack of humility to stand in front of a room of people and talk for half an hour as if my words mean something. But having said that, I am very aware that some of the ideas I'll be talking about tonight.
Yeah, the emoji lag's annoying. It's not as bad further in. I think this was streamed and they just have the stream recording, and the whatever he's using to screencast probably wasn't very good.
Have come from the brains of far smarter and more accomplished people than me. So take everything that I say with a grain of salt. These are humble opinions. And finally, while I think that the Svelte team would broadly agree with the things that I'm going to say tonight, I'm not claiming to speak for them. I'm also not speaking for VERCEL, which is a healthily pluralistic company, even if we all dress the same. These are my humble opinions. I'm going to start with a fairly non-spicy opinion. There's too much thought leadership that would have you believe that JavaScript frameworks are the root of all that is wrong with the web. And if only people would make better technology choices, the web would be perfect.
I want to emphasize how much I love this point. This is a huge part of why I respect Rich so much. There are other people who are the anti-React people, to be clear. This is the framework he's subtweeting but not mentioning. And the anti-React people suck. They are really, really annoying. And most of them aren't here to make the web better. They're here to shit on React and blame it for the web being bad. Rich has never taken this approach. He genuinely respects the hell out of React and has used it as both a point of learning and a point of reference as he has built his own new modern crazy solutions. And obviously he's learned a lot from React and applied that while also going in his own direction. I feel like too many of the React alternative people shit on React too much and make that part of their identity. I've even debated some of those people live in person before. And I find Rich to have a much more sensible middle ground here, especially as a framework author. So yeah, massive credit to Rich for being one of the few post-React people to not fall in the trap of being an anti-React person.
The only problem with it is absolute horseshit. When you last went on a recipe website and had to fight through a gauntlet of ads and newsletter modals and cookie consent banners and the recipe author's story about her childhood memories of Aunt Beryl's butter pecan cookies, and you left thinking, man, if only they had used a different abstraction for creating DOM elements. No, you don't. The web doesn't suck because of JavaScript frameworks. It sucks because of capitalism.
Louder for the ones in the back. Goddamn.
It sucks because of the attention economy, because we pay for everything with data, and because we're all slaves to the algorithm. On some level, we all know this. And so I've come to believe that as framework authors, the most impactful thing we can do isn't fixating on a kilobyte here or a millisecond there. It's empowering developers through education and documentation and diagnostics and sensible defaults to do the right thing in the face of structural forces that bend the web towards sucking it. The other stuff matters, but probably less than we think. Because every now and then, someone will show some data that proves some frameworks deliver better experiences than others. This is a chart that shows how the main JavaScript-centric application frameworks score on core web vitals measurements. You can see that only Astro and SvelteKit outperform the average website. But we have to be careful how we interpret this. For example, Astro explicitly markets itself as being designed for content sites that don't require much interactivity, and so it has a natural advantage over frameworks that are typically used for more demanding workloads. All of which is to say that as much as we love to talk about technology choices, for the most part, you shouldn't feel pressured by me or anybody else to switch away from whatever makes you productive at shipping software.
There's a lot he doesn't say in this that I think is important too. Excuse me. He hints at it a little bit with the whole Astro is targeting a different group. But what he's not hitting is that the people who pick tools like SvelteKit and Astro are picking it because of the performance. And the result is the people who use Astro and Remix, I'll say Remix too. The people who use Astro, Remix, and SvelteKit, they care more about performance. They're going to know more about performance tools. They're going to know more about how to measure and make their apps faster. Even in a world where theoretically Astro was slower than Next by default, because the people using it know more and care more about performance, there is a selection bias there of the people selecting Astro are inherently more likely to know about and care about performance. And when you get to these giant differences, like 90,000 Next websites, 50,000 Nuxt websites, and 500 Astro sites, the scariest thing here is that the Svelte performance isn't much better, honestly, because Svelte's only got 1,400 things that were tracked here. My expectation would be that the SvelteKit devs are aware enough of performance and the importance of it that from here they would be able to and expected to push performance much further. And the fact that Next.js performance gets so close to the average and that these things aren't pushing it too far the other way is exciting. And I do expect Next performance to continue getting better. But since Next is the default, Next is being used by average developers. And average developers are going to write less performant code, not because they're worse devs, but because they have different focuses. And I think we don't talk about the developer picking these frameworks and the bias inherent to that enough. That's like the big addition I wanted to have here that I don't think he touched on enough, but otherwise, very much agree. These numbers don't mean what people seem to think they do.
Next take. Something I've seen more and more of lately is people talking about 0 kilobytes of JavaScript, as in this framework ships 0 kilobytes of JavaScript by default. The implication is that JavaScript is inherently bad, and so a framework that doesn't serve JavaScript is inherently good. But 0 kilobytes of JavaScript is not a goal. The goal is to meet some user need, or if you're cynical, to meet some business need by way of meeting some user need. And sometimes performance is a factor in how effectively you can meet that need. We've all seen the studies showing that for every millisecond delay, Amazon loses $1 billion or whatever. And sometimes you can improve startup performance by having less JavaScript. But doing so is always in the service of some other objective. Collectively, we are in danger of mistaking the means for the ends. And as we'll see later, if you want the best possible performance, JavaScript is actually essential. This is something that I see with things like Lighthouse. Lighthouse is an example of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We're incentivized to chase the green 100 at any cost. That's not how Lighthouse was originally supposed to be used. Lighthouse is a diagnostic tool to help us identify and fix issues. It is not a...
I just had a big aha moment. This is how I have to frame the problem with the YouTube metrics rant I want to do, where these metrics are useful for comparing a before and after, but these metrics are useless for figuring out the health of your channel. These are diagnostic tools, not scorecards, and I fully agree Lighthouse is in that case. I think a lot of YouTube's metrics are in that case. But in the end, the number that matters is number of users, and for me, number of viewers. Are people coming to the site, and are they coming back, and are they using your thing? If so, you're doing well, and if not, you're fucking up. These tools can help you diagnose why things aren't going where you expect, but they're not going to tell you what's wrong. They're going to help you find problems once you've identified something is wrong.
Scorecard. So this is learn.svelte.dev, our interactive platform for learning Svelte and SvelteKit. It gets a pretty lousy performance score because in order to work, it needs to download and install Node inside your browser along with SvelteKit and Vite, and then it needs to start a development server. It is doing a lot of work, and it does it pretty quickly, but not quickly enough for Lighthouse. We could get a better score by only doing that work when you start interacting with the site, but that would be a pretty serious regression in user experience.
That's another thing we don't talk about enough. Not preloading JavaScript can make your numbers look better, but it actually makes using the site worse pretty often. And yeah, it like, especially like one of the things Next does is it will behind the scenes prefetch pages that the links for exist right now. So when you go to another page, it doesn't have to load everything when you click it. It might have enough of it loaded to immediately transition you to it. And that type of functionality makes your web applications and sites feel so much more performant because technically they are. You click a thing and it responds faster. But that means more code has to load on your device. That's a compromise. I just think it's a compromise that is very much worth it a large portion of the time.
I see this pattern over and over again across all different kinds of sites. A single number simply cannot capture that nuance, and you should be aware.
Is he going to do a quick subtweet in here? Because this feels like a hardcore quick subtweet right now.
Wary of people who use those numbers to try and convince you of something. Most sites should work without JavaScript. This might seem like it directly
yeah, I know we're starting to get spicier. I would say sites that can work without JavaScript should. I don't like the word most, and we'll argue all day about the word sites. The way I would have put this is websites that can work without JavaScript should try to. But most of what I build cannot work without JavaScript, fundamentally. And that is fine. Just a difference in what we're building.
Contradicts the previous take, but it doesn't. These two things are both true. Number one, JavaScript is necessary to deliver the best possible user experience. And number two, sometimes you can't rely on JavaScript. A website I reference constantly is this one. Everyone has JavaScript, right? Well, those of us who live in New York are very familiar with the experience of loading a page while at a subway station, but losing connectivity before JavaScript loads. It really sucks. I believe that most web apps should be mostly functional without JavaScript. Take Google Calendar, for example. Obviously, JavaScript is useful here, but is it essential? Can I really not see my appointments and create new ones without JavaScript?
I love you, Rich. You're making a great point here. For the love of Christ, do not talk about calendars until you have tried to build one. Making a calendar work at all is an achievement. Making one work without JavaScript is inhuman. Respect the team at Google Calendar for making a thing that works in the browser. Because this is, yeah. Come back to me when you have a good date picker in Svelte that works without JavaScript, and then we'll chat. But for now, yeah.
The likely answer is, well, we could, but increased development cost isn't worth it. And I'm not blaming the developers for this or for the product managers for having the wrong priorities, but I think it's a shame that the tooling used to build apps like this one don't make it easy enough to build progressively enhanced apps.
No, I can't fixate on the time. I could do like a 2-hour rant about the chaos of date time stuff. What I will say is there is a computer file video. Is it number file? I don't remember. It's either number file or computer file has a video about why you should never, ever deal with date times if you can avoid it. Watch it. Don't touch date times if you don't have to. And if you do, don't do it in HTML. Do it in JavaScript because, yeah, it's one of the oldest Tom Scott videos. Really good vid. It's a Tom Scott. God, now I have to find it and show you guys. But yeah, it was computer file. I was right. It was before Tom Scott left Computer File to do his own channel. And it's almost a decade old. I also want to do a reaction to that after, but great talk. We need to watch this, though.
Ideally, you should get an app that works without JavaScript for free, and that is something that we on the SvelteKit team strive for. For example, we server render everything by default, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how to make it as easy or easier to use forms, which work without JavaScript, than it is to use fetch. Another reason that this is close to my heart is that in my past career as a journalist, I've seen how fragile the web can be as an archival medium when it depends on JavaScript. This is Kim Kardashian's Instagram page at various points over the last decade. Early on, the site was basically just text and images, and we can look at a snapshot today and it's perfectly preserved. By 2019, you can no longer see the actual images. They're still there on her account, I checked, but because they're rendered with JavaScript, they're not part of the archive. Finally, by 2020, the growth hackers got involved, and you can no longer see anything on Instagram without logging in. Now, maybe you don't care what Kim Kardashian was wearing in 2017, but so much of modern culture is mediated through ephemeral digital platforms that there is a real possibility that future historians will have an easier time answering the question, what was it like to live through the space race, than answering the question, what was it like to live through the AI revolution? I think that's a tragedy. 2016 is an interesting case because the content is actually there when you first load the page. But when the JS loads, it looks at the URL bar, says, hey, this isn't Kim Kardashian's profile, and just nukes the entire page. And we can go back to 2016 and fix that. And frankly, if we could go back to 2016, we might have some other priorities. But what we can do is ensure that our tools today are flexible enough to continue working when other...
This one is interesting. I have to think a lot about this one still. I feel I'm on the journalist part, and I feel that a lot, especially when I'm trying to do videos about things that have changed and trying to find the original versions and such. But I don't think it should necessarily be an expectation that every state the web has ever been in is accessible to anyone at any point in time. I'm going to have to think a bit more on this one, but I'm not sure I love this take. It sets an unfair expectation, I would say.
Unexpected things happen. So this is something that SvelteKit actually does out of the box. The client-side router will gracefully figure out the base URL when it starts up. And to demonstrate this, I've deployed a version of our docs to the Interplanetary File System, which is a peer-to-peer network for sharing files. Click on this link. It will work. It does. Okay. So you can see that the URL there has this IPFS / very long string in front of it. The catch with IPFS is you don't know that string until you've generated the site because it's based on the content. So you have this chicken and egg problem. And yet it still works. The client-side routing still works. Really difficult to use a mouse when you're facing backwards at a screen. The client-side routing works, he said, without having checked it. The search function maybe works. Okay, so things are working, even though I'm on a shared Wi-Fi and it's a little bit flaky, obviously.
And using
but
IPFS.
The point is that SvelteKit is designed to be resilient enough to work even in these fairly hostile environments.
I don't know how it's showing. Oh, it's probably like Firefox's loading bar behavior, but you know, if this had JavaScript on it, it could show you an error when it's failing to load and give you some feedback on why the page isn't working. If it had cached some JavaScript, it could run, but besides.
Okay, getting a little spicier.
Ooh.
This is the first opinion that's probably going to make people yell at me when the recording of this goes on YouTube
Listening.
in a couple of weeks. NPAs are dead. So for those of you who aren't captives of web dev Twitter, let me offer some definitions. A multi-page app, or NPA, is what people used to call a website. It's an app where every page is rendered by the server, and if you navigate between pages, the browser will go back to the server, retrieve some fresh HTML, unload the current document, and then create a new document from the new HTML. In contrast, a single page app, or SPA, doesn't unload the document when you navigate. Instead, a client-side router will fetch any code and data it needs for the new page, and it will update the document in place, just like any non-navigation state change. Now, advocates of the multi-page app approach have made the following claims. NPAs are faster because you don't need to load JavaScript. NPAs are more accessible. MPAs are less buggy, and MPAs can work without JavaScript. And in return, the single page app cam says that SPAs are faster because even though you do need to load JavaScript, you're probably going to have to load some JavaScript anyway. And this way you only have to load your analytics or whatever once instead of every single page load. And subsequent navigations are certainly going to be faster because it's much easier to smartly preload data. And
I have a spicy take of my own that comes off of this one. Astro, I love you dearly. Making our docs in Astro was a mistake for Create T3 app. The main reason is that docs pages are pages that you regularly navigate many pages of. You'll go to one page and you'll go to 4 more because you're digging through trying to find a specific thing. The experience of navigation on an SPA is significantly better. This was my mistake. I pushed us really hard to use Astro for our docs site. And I kind of regret it because, man, when I look at the rewrite in something like Nextra or even Docusaurus, it feels better to use the docs. So it is what it is. Just wanted to make that point. The case I thought was as multi-page app as possible, the docs, is something I feel single-page apps do better right now.
you're not recreating a document from scratch on every navigation. SPAs allow you to preserve state between navigations, such as the scroll position of a sidebar or the video that's currently playing. In an SPA, navigation is just like any other state change, so you can do things like continuous transitions. There's a Vue Transitions API coming to the platform, helps with this, and it's a wonderful addition, but it only covers stuff that you can do with CSS. You couldn't, for example, tween a numeric value in a progress indicator like this if you were building a survey app. And SPAs give you a unified development model. Instead of having one language for your HTML and another for your DOM, SPAs are much more cohesive. Now, looking at these two lists, you might say, well, the stuff on the right is nice, but the stuff on the left is non-negotiable. And you'd be right. But the reality is that that list is very out of date. Modern frameworks like Next and Remix and SvelteKit don't suffer from the problems that afflicted early SPAs. And as we've seen, the claim that NPAs are faster than modern SPAs is highly suspect. I've tried to argue in the past that the distinction is actually rather unhelpful, since modern frameworks use techniques from both sides, and I've taken to calling them transitional apps because we do not need any more moronic acronyms. But this isn't why I'm saying that NPAs are dead. We're saying that NPAs are dead because Astro killed them. My Astro friends will be mad at me for saying this, but here's the proof. As of last week, Astro's roadmap includes a client-side router.
Give, please. Ken has client-side routing in Astro. All the things I just said about why the docs kind of suck could be fixed by this. So, yeah.
That would turn your Astro app into a single-page app. In the words of Nate Moore, UI persistence has surfaced as a clear missing piece in the full Astro story. Client-side routing is currently the only way to achieve UI persistence across navigation. Now, they'll be quick to point out that this is opt-in, it's not the default, but here's what's going to happen. They're going to build this thing and they're going to knock it out of the park. And if it's a simple configuration change, then people will try it even if they don't need UI persistence. And they'll discover that for the very small price of a client-side router, their apps suddenly have a nicer user experience. I would not be surprised if the default was reversed in Astro 3 or 4. So on the SvelteKit side, we use client-side routing by default. Unlike some frameworks, we don't use a link component. We just use regular A tags and intercept clicks on them. If you want to disable client-side routing for some reason, you can do it on an individual link by adding a data SvelteKit reload attribute, or you can do it for a whole group of links or even the entire document. Now, one thing that people have rightly criticized SPAs for is that they encourage longer sessions, meaning it's more likely that a new version of the app will be deployed while you're using the old one, which can cause client-side routing to fail because all of the files have moved around. So in SvelteKit, if we detect that case, we will fall back to a full page navigation, which usually fixes it. But we also make it easy to proactively detect new deployments and disable client-side routing when that happens. All right, next opinion is that explicit DSLs, domain-specific languages, are good. DSLs get a bad rap. I like them. DSLs are in contrast to general purpose programming languages like JavaScript. HTML is a DSL, CSS is a DSL,
We'll see where this one goes.
JSON is a DSL, SQL is a DSL, regular expressions are a DSL. We don't tend to think of those as such because they're already so pervasive and people are fine with the DSLs that they already know. But you can do some pretty cool stuff with DSLs. This is Lucy by Matthew Phillips, and it's one of my favorite examples from recent memory. It's a DSL for describing state machines, and you can clearly see how much more expressive the DSL version is than the general purpose.
Is Rich getting Matt P pilled? I've seen this happen a few times. We'll see where this goes.
This is cool, and I want to see more stuff like this. You see, fundamentally, JavaScript is an event-driven language, which means that we predominantly write code in terms of things that are changing in response to things like user action. But when we build user interfaces, we're thinking primarily in terms of state. This is the imperative-declarative split, or whatever you want to call it. So there's an impedance mismatch at the very foundation between the language that we're forced to use and the task for which we're using it. Things like JSX and hooks and signals and all of the other innovations of the front-end world over the last.
I have to think on this one a lot. It's correct, but the implications of this statement hurt. The implications are, if you use this framing for JavaScript versus UI, what is React? And is React still JavaScript? Because React's whole thing is it's just JavaScript. I have to think on this one more. We'll come back to this at some point.
Last decade or so are all in some way an attempt to resolve that contradiction by letting you write code that is state first. HTML, on the other hand, is a really good language for describing UI. There's no temporal aspect to it. It's almost like a physical substance like clay, or at least that's how I think of it. The catch, of course, is that HTML is static, so you can't use it to describe things with rich interactivity. But what if you started with HTML and used that as a springboard to create a new DSL?
Well, I got a video idea quick. I want to notate this before I forget. Love letter to HTML. Cool. That'll be a good one.
Well, that's basically what Svelte is. We've augmented Svelte, we've augmented HTML with state and control flow. We've augmented CSS with scoped styles, and we've augmented JavaScript with reactivity. Some people are really put off by this, and that's totally fine. For people who aren't anti-DSL, we've found that this hits a sweet spot between familiarity and novelty. We're using languages that you already know, but we're extending them in useful ways. And like with the Lucy example, we're able to express UI much more concisely this way. So, I am pro DSL, but there is a crucial caveat. You have to be honest about it. In the Svelte case, we're using .svelte files. When you open a .svelte file, you're entering a kind of liminal space where the normal rules of programming are briefly suspended. And again,
it's not brief. If you're building a Svelte application, you're spending a lot of time in that liminal space, and in that liminal space, the equal sign means something different. This is actually the thing I have most against Svelte personally, is that I live in JavaScript too much to spend time in something that isn't. But I'm very curious where he goes with this one.
Some people want nothing to do with that, and that's fine. I think most of us like having a little magic in our lives from time to time. But here's where it starts to get a little bit too weird for me. If you start changing the semantics of JavaScript inside JavaScript files, I'm out. And this has been a recurring theme recently across a whole bunch of different projects, and it's a phenomenon that I think deserves a little bit more scrutiny than it's currently getting.
Yep, and he's getting Matt Phillips pilled. I called that. Yep. This is a subtweet of me, not directly, but like my belief that React still is just JavaScript is what this is coming after. And I get it. I hear it, but I want to hear more.
Before I give you an example of this, I'm going to tell a little story. Back in 2015, I was working on Rollup, the JavaScript module bundler, and I implemented a heuristic that I thought was pretty clever. If you weren't using the imports from a given module, like ease and transition from D3 transition there, then Rollup simply wouldn't add it to the module graph. It would just discard it. As an escape hatch, if you did need to add the module to the module graph anyway because of some side effects, then you could add the import without any specifiers, and then Rollup would include it. I was young and I was naive, and this seemed like a really smart optimization. Around the same time, the D3 community had browbeaten Mike Bostock into using a module bundler, and he basically said, fine, I'll rewrite everything in CommonJS and use browserify. I was horrified by this because that meant the D3 bundles were going to get slow and large. And so I cold emailed him and said, hey, I really think you should use JavaScript modules for this. And tooling isn't quite there yet, but like, here's the thing that I'm working on. And that was on May 27, 2015. And on May 29th, he started filing issues on Rollup, which I didn't expect and was kind of terrified by. And this is an example of one of them. Now, Mike is the nicest, most wonderful man, and he is much too kind to put it like this. But what he's saying in this issue is JavaScript doesn't work like that, you numpty. And he's right, it doesn't. You can't just remove modules from the graph without fundamentally altering the semantics of the code. Fast forward a few years, and some frameworks have decided that ignoring the semantics of JavaScript isn't just...
Somebody had to say it, and I am thankful it wasn't me. Co-location was a mistake. Take it away, Rich.
Okay, it's actually a core selling point of the framework. I'm going to use Remix as an example, but it's not the only one. Prior to version 13 and the introduction of the app router, Next.js did something very similar.
Remix did this bad. Next did it worse originally. Svelte does it very right now. Next does it mostly right now. But let's go.
For example, and there are others. This is a Remix route. The idea is that your server code, which loads data, can be co-located with your view code. When the client app is built, the loader and anything that it depends on is tree shaken away. But this isn't tree shaking, this is made up non-standard JavaScript semantics. You might think, all right, Rich, you Poindexter, who made you the JavaScript hall monitor? And you'd have a point, but it does have real world impacts. There is actually a whole page in the Remix docs about working around the problems created by this design. And aside from the practical impacts, there's something about the blurring of boundaries between server and client that I think is inherently confusing. I've heard multiple people say that they're often not entirely sure where their code is going to end up running. More alarming to me is the possibility that you could end up with server code in your client bundle. Even Michael, who invented Remix, acknowledges that this is a real world problem. You're one sleep-deprived mistake away from accidentally including something sensitive in the JavaScript that you serve to users. And even if you don't make that mistake, you're still prohibited from using source maps to debug your app in production because the source maps will contain the entire module, including your database queries or whatever.
Underrated issue. Debugging with the new model can be pretty painful, figuring out what is causing a block and where the block is happening. I know VERCEL is working really hard on better like debugging and developer tools and logging for when all of these behaviors hit and happen. But throwing away your source maps does suck. It'd be really cool if you could, in dev, get a proper full stack source map where like the errors make it all the way to client. These are things that are going to improve, but the state they're currently in sucks. And when you're also trying to reinvent a compiler, spending the time to reinvent the dev tools around it is just not something many have the time to do. So this is a very real problem right now, and I don't foresee Remix having a great solution anytime soon, just due to the nature of the world.
So why am I talking about other frameworks' design decisions? I'm not telling you don't use Remix. And I'm not saying the Remix team should make different choices. That's not my business. But oftentimes people will say, other frameworks are doing X, should SvelteKit do the same thing? And then it becomes my business. The reason for the design choice is that it's convenient to co-locate related pieces of code. Now, you don't need to sell me on the benefits of co-location. I was doing single file components back in 2014 before Vue or anyone else.
So close, but so far. If y'all don't know, I'm anti-server component, or not server component, I'm anti SFCs. I like the idea of having two components in a file and breaking up my boundaries how I choose. Yeah.
I am Mr. Colocation. I love it. But collocating code that crosses a server client boundary in a single file is too much for me. We prototyped it in Svelte, and it's always given us bad vibes. So in SvelteKit, we don't collocate in files, we collocate in directories. This is a screenshot of a SvelteKit code base. In a SvelteKit,
this is one of my favorite things about SvelteKit. I was skeptical when I first saw this pattern. I don't love the naming, the plus page.server.js. That feels strange. Don't love that. But the idea of a server file that implicitly loads data into the client file next to it makes the relationship between these things much clearer. I think the way that server components do this, where you move some of the markup in over to this server file, and then once interactions start, that's when client starts. Right, how I want to frame this. Both SvelteKit and server components built the right boundary, but SvelteKit gives you that boundary baked in at an architecture level, whereas server components let you choose when you adopt it and how you adopt it yourself. Both have a boundary and both handle it really well, but SvelteKit's boundary is the relationship between server data and HTML. Server components model is you go from HTML to interactive at the point that you choose now. An interesting distinction for sure, but I do think SvelteKit and Next are the two frameworks that have split this relationship the best.
Yeah, each directory is a root, and each root can contain server code for loading data and view code that runs on both the server and the client. So this is actually the demo app that you get when you do npm create Svelte. Inside source roots, might be hard to see because it's kind of small, there's a lot going on here. But inside source roots, we've got an about root and a Svelte root, which is a Wordle clone that works without JavaScript. The page's server code for the Svelte clone goes in a page server.js file on the left here. And any file with that suffix cannot be imported into client-side code. Your app will simply fail to build. And directory-based routing is something that we stole from Next.js, and it has a list of other benefits that's too long to get into right now, but I strongly believe that this is the way. One little Easter egg that I'll show you is that on the right, in page.svelte on line 16, we're hovering over data.guesses, and it's giving us the type and the inline documentation that we wrote on the left on line 9. So we get type safety across the network. This is the sort of thing that's made possible by embracing strong conventions. And far from being a worse developer experience, I actually find this preferable. I'll often have my data loading server code open on one side and the view code that uses it on the other. Screens are wide, but files are tall, and so it's just a bad use of real estate to try and stack everything into a single file.
This might be the take in here I disagree with the most. Don't know if y'all have seen how I use my editor, but like, this isn't just for stream. I rock like 18 to 20 point font when I code. And I rock one file open, full screen on my computer. This is not too far from how I work. And you can ask anybody who's seen me sit on my couch and code. This is how I do it. What I will always aim for is reducing the amount of context necessary to solve a problem to be as small an amount as possible. So ideally, I can open one file, make one change in the right place, and be done. But I went from being a 3-monitor Andy with like my crazy fancy setup with like a vertical monitor, 2 horizontal ones, and everything spaced out crazy, to just coding on my laptop. And I love it. So, yeah, it is what it is. I've converted a lot of people. Try it if you haven't. Like, seriously, just turn off your monitors for a week and use your laptop. See what happens. You might surprise yourself. Anyways.
Okay, another example of non-standard semantics, this time from the Quick team. Quick is a framework that transforms your code in such a way that it can lazily load individual functions when it needs them and then recreate their lexical scope. It is extremely clever stuff and is worth paying attention to. Well, I personally have some reservations about stuff like this. If you move the increment function out of the block of JSX, the app breaks. If it was JavaScript, that would be fine, but it's not JavaScript, it's Quick. It's effectively a DSL for more granular code splitting. By the same token, you have to be careful about what values you reference inside that function, because in order to recreate the lexical scope, the framework has to serialize it. I mentioned this on Twitter a while back, and within a few hours, Manu from the Quick team had added a much more helpful error message so that you can diagnose the problem, because they are brilliant and dedicated. But this is really just one example of a more wide-ranging trend that I'm seeing, where in order to successfully work with JavaScript or TypeScript, you have to understand some very sophisticated transformations that are happening behind the scenes. There are some other drawbacks to the lazy loading approach, like you can't.
We haven't talked about server actions much because I can't talk about server actions yet, but there is definitely concern in this regard of like, is it clear enough what's being passed and what's actually being passed? Like, if you pass a function to a thing, be explicit about what's happening.
Conditionally prevent an event default, which is something I do all the time, without opting out of the programming model altogether. But fundamentally, it's this mismatch between what the code does and what it looks like it does that I get hung up on. For an experiment, I asked ChatGPT to refactor the component, and at first it tried to enforce React idioms, but when I explained that we can't use state here, it made the exact same mistake, hoisting the increment function out of the JSX because it thought it was dealing with JavaScript. Another example from Solid. It looks very much like these two.
This one's slightly off because you have to call count as a function. But I get this one and how this one sucks if you're really React brained. This one doesn't suck if you're like signal brained. Oh, I'm paused. Come on. Did I mute accidentally? Yeah, my bad.
Another example from Solid. It looks very much like these two components should behave the same way based on our understanding.
Since count is on props, you don't need to call it as a function. Learn something every day.
Understanding of JSX and JavaScript, but they're actually very different. If you're familiar with Solid, then this makes total sense, but there's no obvious signpost here. So will people with less familiarity be able to successfully maintain this code base 5 years from now? I don't know. Maybe. I don't mean to pick on these frameworks because they're all doing really interesting and cool stuff. These are just some particularly notable examples. And, they will all point out elements of Svelte's programming model that they're not very keen on. And nor am I telling you what to think. I do encourage you to play around with these frameworks and develop your own opinion. I'm just telling you what I think. And what I think is that your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. Okay, this doesn't feel like it should be a particularly spicy take, but it does have some moderately spicy implications.
That's a good way of putting it. The implications here are spicier than the take, and I'm curious as ever to hear what he has to say about this.
Other things being equal, code should run as close to the user as possible. So the edge is better than a central server, but on device is better than the edge. Now, other things are not always equal. Sometimes you need to access your database, in which case your code should run near your database. And sometimes you need to have access to sensitive information that can't be exposed to the client. But there's a lot of stuff that doesn't fall into that category. For example, if I add a product to my shopping cart, I should be able to see that reflected immediately.
I like that he's doing distance beyond global versus regional edge and is going all the way from like the closest, which is the client, to the furthest, which is an off like server in a specific location that is far away from you. Because there are granular levels here. And I know Svelte's goal is to always put the code in the right place, but at the very least, we can talk about those different places. And he opened up a really good opportunity in framing here. That's kind of Rich's thing, is giving us a new way to talk about the stuff. And he's done a good job so far here.
Another example that we're all familiar with, when you're writing a comment in GitHub, you can't preview it without sending the comment to the server so that it can render the markdown. Sometimes it's pretty slow. You can absolutely do markdown rendering and syntax highlighting in the browser. Maybe you'd want to be lazy about loading the grammars that you use for the syntax highlighting, but it is a very solvable problem, and it will provide a much nicer user experience. And this isn't just about latency, it's also about resilience. I travel by Amtrak a fair bit, and every time I do, I'm like, great, 3 hours of uninterrupted work. But then I keep running into things like that because my connection is so flaky, and so most times I'll just give up and read a book instead. It's not just Amtrak, it's also every time I'm on the subway, or even when I'm walking down the stairs to leave my flat and my phone switches from Wi-Fi to cellular just as I'm trying to look at the details of where I'm supposed to be going. Turns out we're pretty bad at building things in an offline first way at the best of times. All of this is why I'm personally a little bit nervous about React server components. For those of you who aren't aware, RSC means that your UI is rendered on the server by default, and only components that have a special use client directive will run in the browser and have access to things like use state and use effect. Server components and client components have different APIs, they can use different hooks, and there are restrictions on how you can combine them. But the upshot is that by default, in the future, your React app will run entirely on the server and you will opt in to client rendering for specific parts of your app. Now, clearly this has some very substantial benefits. This is hugely important work, and frankly, it blows my mind. But I do worry that we'll become so paranoid about serving JavaScript to our users that we're overcorrecting. If the default interaction is to require a server round trip, for client components to be implicitly regarded as something to avoid, then the net result could be slower and less resilient web apps.
This is why VERCEL hiring Rich makes so much sense, because there's two paths things can go. Either Rich is wrong and server components win, they're the objective, better experience for everybody, and we end up in the new world where everything's server component first. Or Rich is right, we went too far, and SvelteKit becomes the best framework for having a good experience on both client and server. Either way, VERCEL wins, but they get to bet on both horses because they own both horses. It's kind of genius. And I think Rich is a bit wrong here. Specifically, I think that a combination of preloading some server stuff, like in Next, it will prefetch the pages that are accessible on the page you're on so that when you navigate to them, it can navigate faster. If it does that when it loads, and then you lose your internet and you go to one of those pages, it will still be able to load a lot of it, if not the whole thing. And since the interactions, which are the things you're actually doing on the site, have to be client components anyways, the experience there doesn't change at all. The catch is, how often are we refreshing the DOM from the server? And how much do developers rely on those refreshes to be their main method of state? Like, are we going to see a world where somebody presses one key and it does a server request and then renders new HTML on every key press? That would be a disaster. And I really don't think we're going that way, but it's possible. Versus we use the server to get the right content down to the client as quickly as possible, and then the client and its interactions are done on their device. There's a delicate balance to be found here. I personally think React is on the winning side, but I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, it's because Rich is right. And we will see how things go.
I might just be fear-mongering here. I don't know. Dan Abramov is probably going to do a withering tweet thread on why I'm wrong about this. But I'm very curious to see how this is all going to look in a couple of years with the benefit of hindsight. Okay, another spicy take. We will regret reinventing RPC. RPC stands for Remote Procedure Call. Is an idea that has been around since the 70s. Basically what it means is that instead of passing a message to a server and waiting for a response, you call a function on the server instead, and the RPC protocol takes care of the actual message passing. In effect, it allows you to pretend that a distributed system is not distributed. You're just calling functions. Now, back in the 80s, people were calling the wisdom of this idea into question. This 1988 paper by Andrew Tannenbaum called A Critique of the Remote Procedure Call Paradigm is very much of its time, but it's still worth reading. Some arguments can't be serialized correctly. Serializing closures is particularly hairy. If the server mutates arguments, that mutation won't be respected on the client. Network errors and logic errors all kind of get smushed together. All of these things are easy to deal with if you're not hiding the implementation details. But over the past few months, RPC has had a bit of a renaissance in the front-end world.
And once again, I wish TRPC wasn't named TRPC, because it is not included in what he is describing here. What he is describing is things like what Bling's doing with server $, or what a theoretical framework that's name rhymes with Preact is doing with a theoretical protocol that rhymes with Merverm actions. I get why he's subtweeting this here. I understand what he's talking about. TRPC is not included in this. Let's continue.
Except that we now call it server function. I first saw it in Solid Start. The idea is that you write code like this, and oh, hang on, the write code like this. I'm gonna have to try and remember my slides because I messed this up. And the compiler sort of waves a magic wand, and you can call code on your server as though it were a local function. So the ergonomics of this are undeniably really nice. You even get type safety because as far as TypeScript is concerned, it is just a local function. But a while back, Jason Miller, the creator of Preact, did a tweet that I found quite interesting. He said in effect that these abstractions are dangerous. I hope he's wrong, but I think he might be right. I can take this example here. This server function looks and feels like an internal implementation detail, but it's not. We've actually made an HTTP endpoint that anyone can call with any data. So TypeScript is telling us that field can be name or quantity, but in reality, it could be name, semicolon, drop table users. If you know, you know. So when you make an endpoint explicit and you're working with form data, you're aware on some level that the data is untrusted. And so, I think you're much less likely to make this sort of error than...
So, fun fact about database.js for what it's worth. If you use PlanetScale's database.js, you can't pass variables and values in the DB query string. You have to pass them as arguments. And when you do that, they sanitize them. So this specific bug is not possible if you use database.js specifically. But yes, there is a possibility of this being a problem in the future if this sorted data call is something that anyone can change the input of. There's a lot of it depends here, and I see the concern. It makes a lot of sense, but we are entering a new world. Back to where we were.
And if it looks like a private function call, and you might be thinking, Rich, come on, I would never make that mistake. But look to your left and look to your right at the people around you. Do you trust them not to make that mistake? I don't know. Bear in mind also that if you use source maps for debugging and they contain the original server code, you're basically handing attackers a diagram of your defenses. This shit makes me very nervous. So people have asked us to add this to SvelteKit, and we've said no. Maybe one day, once enough people have fucked around and found out, we'll do it, but not yet. We think that part of our responsibility as toolmakers is, to the extent that we're able, to help protect you and your users against these sorts of issues.
I miss Rich's face. That is all.
So SvelteKit has built-in CSRF protection. It has CSP primitives. And we don't do things like that just because they feel convenient. Okay, I'm rating this one low on the Scoville scale.
This is fascinating with his recent JS doc stuff. I'm curious where he goes with this one.
Even though it seems like an unpopular opinion, because I think it's actually pretty obvious. Build steps are good. There's this idea that comes up every now and again in front end that build tools are the devil's work and that we would all be much better off without them. This is a recent example that gained some traction from the Dino blog, and it's one of the better versions of this argument that I've seen. Normally they're a lot angrier. But the thing that often gets missed in discussions about build steps is that they primarily exist for a user's benefit, not for ours.
That's a spicy one, especially since he axed TypeScript in favor of JSDoc to avoid a build step. But he likes these build steps. I get it. There's a balance here. Interesting. I want to see where he goes with this.
Build steps let us minify code. They let us combine 100 small modules into 10 coarse-grained chunks that load faster. They remove unused code from client-side bundles. They optimize images. They hash assets so that they can be cached immutably. They guard against bugs by type checking and linting. This is all stuff that directly results in a better user experience. It's true that build steps also benefit developers by letting us use non-standard dialects, easily import dependencies and things like that. But if you remove build steps, it's user experience that suffers more than developer experience. And yet, interestingly, if you look at the people who complain most vociferously that our industry prizes DX over UX, and then look at the people who want to get rid of build tooling, there is a striking overlap.
This is a diagram I need to steal and use for a lot of things. I'm going to use this exact framing to complain about a lot of things in the near future. Thank you for this diagram, Rich. I'm going to abuse this. I always do the Venn diagram where like the two circles are separate and barely touch. I hadn't thought of taking two contradicting views that people often have and overlapping it this way. Like, here's one. People who complain about Tailwind. People who complain about React performance. This one pisses me off to no end, specifically because Tailwind's performance is absurd. Like, Tailwind does CSS better than you do, and it will make your applications load faster, have faster CSS bundles, better minification, and just generally makes your apps better than if you used any CSS and JS solution or most CSS styling solutions. Tailwind is uniquely performant, where if you take an app you wrote in vanilla CSS correctly and you take that same app and write it in Tailwind, the Tailwind site will be smaller and actually load faster. And I find the people who bitch about Tailwind the most also hate React, and I can never get them to concede that Tailwind is actually one of the most performant styling solutions. Because the people who live in this middle area are delusional. And that's fine. We all have our delusions. But I like this diagram as a way of pointing out these contradictions, and I will be using this a lot. So thank you, Rich, for that. Let's finish this up.
It's hard not to conclude that it comes more from a reflexively anti-tooling mindset than a genuine concern for users. Here's another example of a build step being really beneficial that I didn't get around to doing a slide for. And all of the code snippets in SvelteKit's documentation are type checked against the SvelteKit source code. So, for example, this code down here is checked at deploy time to make sure that it doesn't contain any errors and that it's up to date with current types in SvelteKit itself. And that unavoidably takes time. One of these pages might take several seconds to render on this M1 MacBook Pro. So we pre-render this content at build time, as well as ensuring that we don't publish incorrect documentation, because if we do, the deployment will fail. It means that everyone visiting this site gets content instantly. If we did that rendering on demand instead, then even if we had incredibly sophisticated caching, some users would end up having to wait multiple seconds for the page to load, and that is just not acceptable. So, build steps. You might not need one, but you should probably have one anyway. Okay, my final take of the evening is that none of this matters. I don't think AI is going to take all our jobs, but I do think there's a better than even chance that it's going to change them beyond all recognition. Might not be long before talking about these sorts of code preferences feel like talking about what implement you want to use to make holes in your punch cards.
Not sure how I feel about this one specifically. I like the general none of this matters, but the goal of AI is to do human work but faster. If we make the work better for humans, we're also making it better for robots. And all of the things we're bickering about and improving and changing and learning from here are all the things we feed to the robots to make them better too. So the robots are capped at the capabilities of the humans who built them and the tools that we built. I don't think this is necessarily fair. And neither does my kitten, who just got on my desk to come say hi. So let me make enough room for him. We can do a very quick cat break. Hi, bud. Morning, bud. Finishing this up quick.
What implement you want to use to make holes in your punch cards. So for the few weeks in which any of this is still relevant, let's have interesting debates and share our ideas, but let's not take ourselves too seriously. and let's have fun building stuff however we like to build stuff. That is my time. Thank you for hearing me.
Shoot, now I want to replay it. Just wanted to pause it, reflect on it. This was an awesome talk. As per usual, Rich came in with the spice and delivered. And yes, he delivered hard here. I almost entirely agree. I think the details of where we don't agree are going to be the front of the next like era of this JavaScript war. It's nice that so many of the things we've been fighting over for the last 10 years now are over. Like SPA's won, build steps won, TypeScript won. All of these things have become essential expectations in modern web dev tooling. But the next era is kind of figuring out what is too far and kind of figuring out what the relationship between the client and the server is as we continue to iterate on software. It's really nice seeing Rich continue to push that conversation and find new ways for us to frame it and talk about it. I got a lot out of this talk. I hope y'all did as well. If you enjoyed it, let me know. Since we talked a lot about that client server boundary, I'm going to pin a video here where I go in depth on those boundaries and the type safety of them. It's a really good video. Put a lot of effort into it. Check it out if you haven't already. Thank you guys as always. Peace, nerds.